Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for attending today's session with Mitzi. So she asked me to do an intro. So let me introduce her. Some of you already know her, but let me introduce her. So she's the founder of an independent governance, risk and compliance consultancy, working with regulated businesses across areas including AML, governance, AI, and wider regulatory compliance. She is also an international speaker and writer on governance, risk, and neurodiversity in business. And she was honored to receive the ICA Outstanding Achievement Award in AML after achieving the highest global mark in the ICA Advanced Certificate in Anti-Money Laundering. So today's session she will actually tell us about why neurodiversity isn't just a well-being issue, but a commercial, governance, and innovation issue for organizations. So it's a new topic for me as well. I'm looking forward to learn a lot of new things, and then I hope it will help others as well. And stage is all yours.
Thank you. So I am just going to reattach this. We good? Perfect. So good evening, everyone, and thank you to the Launchpad for having me. It's really nice to see so many people here, particularly because I know I'm competing with the weather. So before I begin, just a little disclaimer, we're obviously recording, but if anybody is planning to play it on double speed and make it into a meme about ADHD, I can't believe it wasn't diagnosed. No, please don't. That's not the legacy I want. So yes, for those of you who haven't met me, I'm Mitzi, like Chamara said, and I run an independent risk governance and compliance consultancy working with regulated businesses, so like TCSPs, and also regulated adjacent businesses, so things like capital exchanges. And I do everything from anti-money laundering and financial crime to governance and AI. I'm also neurodivergent. I'm ADHD and autistic. I have other things as well. And just to start by saying, I know a lot of different people use different terms to describe themselves and describe others. Those are the ones I use. Obviously, everybody has different ones. So for me, this isn't just a topic that I talk about professionally. It's something that I live every day. And before we get into the story, I really want to be clear about what tonight is meant to be and what it isn't. This really isn't a talk asking you to feel sorry for neurodivergent people. It also isn't meant to be medical advice. It's certainly not about lowering standards, and it's not about ticking a diversity box. Oh, I went to the talk, it's okay, we're inclusive. No. In fact, if that's why you're here, you're going to be a bit disappointed. Because I don't think neurodiversity is primarily a wellbeing issue. I think it's all about the commerciality. It's a governance issue, an innovation issue. And organisations need to understand the different ways of thinking that are going on because it will help them build better businesses. And it's as simple as that. So whether you're neurodivergent yourself, whether you think you might be, whether you manage people, run a business, have colleagues, have children or partners who are neurodivergent, or whether you're just curious about what this is, I'm hoping that I might be able to add something new or change your opinion tonight. Because this isn't really a talk about ADHD and autism, it's a talk about people and brains and how everybody works differently. About what happens when somebody spends years trying to fit into an environment that was never designed for them, and about what happens when they finally stop trying to. You'll notice that the title of tonight's talk is "This Wasn't the Plan." That sentence ends up coming up in every chapter of my life, so I thought it was quite a good name. I always thought I knew exactly where I was going, but life had other ideas. And looking back, I'm incredibly glad it did. So before we get too carried away, this is my little attempt at being interactive. So there's a QR code for the Slido. If you get it and scan it, that'd be great. So then you can submit your questions throughout the evening. So it can be completely anonymous, which is why I'm running it from my phone. So if you accidentally put your name in, it isn't going to come up on the screen. So if there's anything that you've always wondered about neurodiversity that you've never felt comfortable asking, ask it anonymously tonight, because I can't see who's asked. And when I say anything, I genuinely mean anything. You could ask about masking, diagnosis, medication, work, relationships, whether you think you might be neurodivergent yourself or whether you think somebody you know might be. There are no silly questions. When I started this year, I knew so little about it, and now I know maybe a tiny bit more, and I still learn more every day. I'd much rather ask somebody ask a question they might be worried about asking than leave still wondering. So I'll just give everybody a minute to get that. Go. So Slido's going to stay live throughout the session, so if something pops into your head halfway, just add it on. You are welcome just to ask a question sort of verbally, but I know not everybody likes to do that. So I think it's going to be interesting because I've done a few talks sort of internationally about neurodivergence, and the sets of questions that come out are always totally different. So I'm really interested to sort of see tonight what's gonna come out, and I'm hoping we can have a really honest conversation rather than just me talking at you. So if everybody's got it, I'll get started. So this wasn't the plan, as you can see from the slide. So it will stay live throughout the session, Slido, so if something occurs, you just put it on. I'm going to keep an eye as we go on my phone, so if something fits really well with kind of the next slide, I'll just try to tag it in there. I'm not trying to pretend that I know everything. I know a little bit about my own experience, and that's pretty much it. So I think when I say this wasn't the plan, it's true in two different ways. The first is this probably wasn't the talk you're expecting tonight. Some people hear the words neurodiversity and think that it's going to all be about the diagnostic criteria, brain scan statistics. It's a little bit of that later, but it's mostly the story, because I think that people don't change their minds when they see a graph. As a compliance professional, you can show somebody all of the data in the world, but until they buy into it, they don't believe it. So I think the best way to change people's minds is to tell them a convincing, real story. And the second reason it wasn't the plan is because it's much more personal. Unlike when people say, well, that wasn't the plan, when, if we're honest, there wasn't really a plan to begin with. I did actually have a plan. I thought I knew what success looked like. I thought if I worked hard enough, got the right qualifications, made sensible decisions, life would unfold in a fairly logical order. It turns out that wasn't going to happen. In fact, I joke at home that if this was a television series, it would be a woke version of Breaking Bad. Instead of meth, it's governance, trauma, accessibility training, and a healthy amount of enthusiasm for anti-money laundering. I promise it is as exciting as it sounds. So over the next 40 minutes, I'm going to tell you about a career I never planned, diagnoses I never expected, and challenges I couldn't have imagined, but also opportunities that I didn't know existed, and arguably didn't. Looking back, I don't think the problem was that my plans failed. I think it was that I was trying to follow a route that simply wasn't designed for how my brain works. For years, I thought success meant becoming better fitted into the environments, but that could be exhausting. And what I've learned is completely different. Success isn't about changing yourself. It's about finding or building an environment where you can naturally play to all of your advantages, rather than constantly trying to achieve someone else's version of good. And that's what tonight is about. It's not the story of how I discovered I have ADHD, it's the story of what happened when I finally stopped asking what's wrong with me and started asking, what if I'm asking the wrong question? Because I think that's a question that's relevant to far more than just neurodivergent people. It's relevant to organisations, leaders, and anybody who's felt like they're trying to work twice as hard just to fit into something that doesn't quite make sense. So let's start at the beginning. So I probably wanted to be an advocate. If you'd asked me when I was younger what I wanted to do, that is what I would have said. For years, that was the plan. I loved analysing problems, I loved researching, I loved building arguments. I loved taking a really complicated issue and pulling it to bits and trying to work out what the right answer was. Looking back, that's not a million miles away from what I do now. The subject matter has changed, but I still spend most of my life looking at complicated problems and asking what is actually going on. At the time though, I genuinely thought law was where I'd end up. That's interesting that in legal careers there are a disproportionate number of neurodivergent people, particularly those that are later diagnosed in life. When you think about it, it does make perfect sense. Law rewards attention to detail, pattern recognition, curiosity, research, being able to hold huge amounts of information in your head, being prepared to spend hours disappearing down a rabbit hole because one sentence just doesn't quite make sense. So if you're autistic, that's not called procrastination, it's called Tuesday. Those are all strengths that many neurodivergent people naturally have and have honed through years of building their own systems. And the older I get, the more I realise that something just didn't quite feel right. It wasn't that I hated the idea of law, it was more subtle than that. There were parts of it that I absolutely loved, and other parts of it that made me deeply uncomfortable. And at the time, I couldn't really understand why. And now, I'm not still sure I can explain why, so here we go. I just knew something didn't fit. Now, looking back with the benefit of a diagnosis, I can see a lot better. It wasn't that I'd chosen the wrong career. It was that I was beginning to notice there was a difference between that and the ideals I admired, and a career that actually suited the way my brain works. I think that's something we don't talk about enough. We're often asked, what are you good at? And less often we're asked, what brings you energy? Because they aren't always the same thing. You can be brilliant at something, and you can still absolutely hate and be exhausted doing it. And that's a really important distinction for everybody, but especially for neurodiverse people. We're incredibly good at doing things that cost us an enormous amount of energy, but that doesn't necessarily mean they're the right fit. I often think of myself as like a triangle in a world that's for squares. You can fit it in, but you have to bend it round. And then if you do it over and over again and jam it, the corners are going to come off, which is sad, but it's okay now. I didn't have any language for anything like this at the time. I just thought something feels off, and it turns out my instinct was right. I wouldn't understand for nearly 10 years further what it was. So at 14, I realised that I was passionate about writing. So not writing occasional stories for homework, the kind of writing that you do at 2 o'clock in the morning, stories, descriptions. It turns out that was actually really quite recurring in my life. I realised fairly quickly I probably wasn't going to become a millionaire writing novels though. But that wasn't really the point. I wasn't writing because I thought it would make me successful or known. I was writing because I genuinely couldn't imagine myself not writing. And that's still the case now. Anybody who follows me on LinkedIn will know I post perpetually with stuff I've come up with. Looking back, I do laugh at how all of this happened. I used to spend hours writing descriptions of places. Not stories, not dialogue, not action, often not even any characters. It was just describing a room, the weather, the setting. And looking back, I do often think if that isn't autism, I don't know what is. When people say, oh, weren't there signs? Yes, there were. But again, I didn't have an idea until a lot later. And it makes me smile that nobody thought, oh, she's writing 3 pages about a tree, maybe we should investigate. They just thought I really liked writing. And to be fair, I do. Writing has become a place where my brain makes sense. If I'm confused about something, I can write it down. If I'm trying to understand myself or the world, I write it down. It's almost like my brain is trying to put something on paper before it can see it anywhere else. By the time I was 15, I'd started writing what would become my first novel. And at 17, it was published. At the time, I saw it as a hobby. I was in the 6th form, and it was the first time I ever saw that my brain was really naturally good at certain things. Hyperfocus could be useful. Noticing tiny details was really useful. Making unusual connections between different things was really useful. Spending hours obsessing over one sentence, really useful if you're trying to edit. One thing people often ask me is, would you get rid of your ADHD or autism if you could? I don't think it's that simple, but no. Because yes, there are definitely parts of it that are incredibly difficult. And that is one thing I always try to share on my social media, that it's not as simple as what I like to call the screwed superstar dichotomy. People either saying that, hooray, you have ADHD, you're amazing, or, oh no, you have ADHD, life's gonna be so hard for you. As everything, it's far less black and white than that. There's also parts of it that have given me a career. My curiosity, my creativity, my ability to spot patterns, the reason I can sit with a governance problem for hours until something works, the reason I enjoy writing, speaking, the reason I can build AI tools for clients one day and write an article the next. It's all the same brain. That's why I don't really like the conversation being framed as that dichotomy, because it isn't as simple as that. It can be both at the same time. Sometimes brilliant, also exhausting, and also both before lunchtime. And I think we do people a disservice when we try to say it's only one or the other. That was one of the first lessons I learned, although I didn't realise it at the time, is that things make us different. They're often the things that make us our best selves. Not everywhere, but in the right environment. And that idea is something that came up again and again throughout my life. So lockdown changed everything. I was just starting to work out a little bit about who I was and what was going on. Then the world stopped. I was 16 when we locked down in 2020. I was in year 11, so the final year of compulsory secondary school. Like everyone else, I watched the news when the schools closed, when they said that we're going to be cancelling GCSEs. For a lot of people that was disappointing. For me, it was a lot bigger than that. I'd spent years working towards that. That had been my goal, get good qualifications. Not actually because I loved exams. I don't think anybody wakes up and thinks, oh, it's algebra o'clock. But because exams represented the end phase of one life and beginning of another. And I'd always had that picture in my head. You work hard, you sit exams, you get results, you move on. Those are the rules. And almost overnight, the rules disappeared. I remember thinking, so what was all of that for? Because suddenly there wasn't a finish line anymore. There was no certainty. Looking back, I think that uncertainty affected me a lot more than I realise. One thing I've learned about myself since being diagnosed is that I really like understanding the rules of the game, or understanding that there are none, if that's the case. Tell me how something works, tell me what success looks like, tell me what the expectations are. I don't mind working incredibly hard, I just need to know what the rules are. And suddenly, nobody knew. We were all making it up as we go along. It's funny because people often think autistic people struggle because they don't like change. I don't actually think that's quite true. I think most autistic people cope perfectly well with change, when that change makes sense. What's much harder is uncertainty, not knowing what's going to happen, not knowing what will happen next, not knowing what's expected, not knowing whether the rules have changed. Lockdown was uncertain globally. Nobody had a manual, nobody knew what next week looked like. I always joke, that was the longest 2 weeks I've ever seen. Having said that, there are a lot of things that are unexpectedly positive about it. The first time ever, the world seemed to slow down. Meetings were online, people communicated more in writing, social expectations changed. Finally, you could say you didn't want to shake somebody's hand. And in a strange way, some aspects of life actually became more accessible, and I think that's something we don't talk about enough. The pandemic was undoubtedly devastating in so many ways, but it accidentally demonstrated that a lot of the adjustments disabled and neurodivergent people need and have been asking for were possible all along. Remote working, flexible learning, hybrid meetings, they weren't impossible, we just hadn't chosen to do them. That lesson has stayed with me ever since, because when someone says, we've always done it this way, I can't help thinking, well, 2020 proved that we didn't have to. Looking back, I can see that lockdown didn't just interrupt my plans, it quietly changed the way I thought about work, about education, flexibility, and what was actually possible. At the time, it felt like just another chapter where, once again, it wasn't the plan. So, after lockdown, I went into sixth form, and if I'm honest, I don't think I ever quite got my roadmap back. Before the pandemic, everything felt linear, school, exams, university, career, simple, except it wasn't anymore. So when it came to choosing my A-levels, I made a very scientific decision. I picked the subjects I actually enjoyed: English language, English literature, and philosophy. Looking back, they all had something in common. None of them are really about memorising facts. They're about asking questions and analysing ideas, looking beneath the surface and seeing different interpretations and realising how both can exist at the same time. Which, if you knew me now, probably isn't much of a surprise. I've somehow managed to build an entire career by just asking awkward questions. By this point, I'd also accepted something else. Law was probably not where I was going to end up. Not because I'd stopped finding it interesting. I still did and I still do. But because I couldn't ignore the feeling that there was just something that wasn't quite the right fit. There was one thing that I was determined to do though. I wanted to sit the ELAT, which is the English Literature Admissions Test. Now I appreciate saying I always wanted to sit an admissions exam doesn't sound the most teenage ambition. Most people my age wanted to go to festivals. I wanted to experience the exam because remember, I hadn't had one. Again, it's not neurodivergent, I don't know what it is, but there was a reason. Because all of my GCSEs had been cancelled, I had never tried a written exam, and that bothered me, particularly going into my A-levels. It felt like something had been taken away, and I wanted to know what it felt like to prepare properly. To walk into an exam hall, admittedly where I was the only person sitting the exam, to be challenged, to prove myself that I could do it. And it wasn't really about university anymore. It was about finishing something I never had the chance to finish. So I revised, which is really funny because most people will tell you you can't really revise for the ELAT. And I sat it, and then I waited. I didn't really expect anything remarkable to happen because at this point I'd learned that life has a habit of doing what it wants to do. And it turns out it did. So I sat the ELAT, and then to my complete surprise, I was offered into King's College. I still remember seeing the email with the words, "Congratulations." For most people, that's one of those moments you celebrate, and I did, for about 5 minutes, because once the excitement had settled, another question appeared. Did I actually want to go? Everyone around me assured me the answer was yes. I mean, why wouldn't it be? Good university, London, exactly the sort of incredible opportunity I'd worked hard for. But the more I thought about it, the more uncomfortable I became. It wasn't that there was anything wrong with King's, there isn't. It's just that didn't feel like my path. I built this picture in my head of living in halls, big lectures, freshers week, drinking culture, constant socialising, and it sounded completely exhausting. So before anybody from King's complains, I'm sure there are lots of excellent people that have been there, and I have no criticisms of the universities themselves. It's for me, it was realising that that isn't going to be a suitable setting. Sometimes the thing everybody else wants for you isn't actually the right thing for you at all. And that was a really, really uncomfortable realisation, because we're taught from a very young age that success follows a particular route. You go to university, you get a graduate job, you climb the ladder. You don't normally get to 20 and say, actually, I think I'd like to do something completely different. Looking back now, I think that was one of the first genuinely autistic decisions I ever made before I knew I was autistic, because turning down the university was me saying, what does everybody else think I should do versus what do I actually want to do? And those are two very different questions, and that's something I encourage organisations to think about as well, because businesses often recruit in exactly the same way. They ask who's got the best CV, or who interviewed best, not is this person actually the best person for the job? And that's the governance question as much as it's a people question. So I turned down King's, which is a surprise to a lot of people, including me, for quite a while. But looking back, I don't regret it, not once, because if I'd gone, I probably wouldn't have become an appropriate adult. I wouldn't have discovered compliance, I wouldn't have won the ICA award, and I probably wouldn't have started my consultancy. And I almost certainly wouldn't be standing here tonight. One decision, again, has changed everything. And as you're probably beginning to realise, that wasn't the plan. So around the time all this was happening, there was a lot more going on in my personal life. While I was trying to work out what my future looked like, my granddad was becoming increasingly unwell. Gradually, I found myself taking on more and more of his care. He had a condition called cerebral amyloid angiopathy, which is a form of dementia. One of the hardest parts wasn't just the illness itself, it was the unpredictability. Some days you could have a conversation with him, be like, oh, he's doing really well, and then he might need help with basic needs. Every morning you woke up not really knowing which version of him you were going to get that day. Looking back, I think that taught me something that has stayed with me ever since. People assume that resilience looks dramatic, and it really doesn't. Most of the time, resilience looks incredibly boring and ordinary. It looks like making a cup of tea, helping someone get dressed, going to work, going to Tesco's, then getting up the next day and doing it all again. And nobody applauds in that moment, but quite often those are the things that change you over time. There's another part of the story I've thought about since getting my diagnosis. As far as we know, my granddad was never formally diagnosed with anything. But as a family, we always said granddad might be autistic. Looking back now, there were so many things that made sense. His routines, his interests, the way he thought, the way he spoke, the way he approached the world. He was an aerospace engineer. Of course, his generation didn't grow up talking about autism, particularly not when you're a pretty functional, intelligent person. It was just that he was different. He was just different and he got away with it. There wasn't language we have today, and sometimes I wonder how his life might have been different if he was born now. Would somebody have recognised it? Would the world have understood him better? Would his life have been easier? I don't know, but I do think about it quite a lot. Because one of the things I realised after my own diagnosis is that diagnosis doesn't change who you are. It just helps you understand who you've always been. And sometimes I wish I'd had the opportunity as well. Caring for him also taught me something else. It taught me not to make assumptions about people. At the time, I looked like a fairly typical teenager. I was studying, trying to work out what career I wanted. From the outside, my life probably looked fairly normal, but what people couldn't see was that every decision was shaping my future, and I was going home to help look after somebody. I was having care responsibilities that most people my age simply didn't have. And that's something I've never forgotten. Because in business, we make assumptions all the time. We look at someone's performance, their attendance, their behaviour, their productivity, and we quietly build up an image in our head based on assumptions. All the assumptions about why they're like this, when the truth is, we usually know a lot less than we think we do. Everyone you work with is carrying something. Sometimes it's visible, sometimes it isn't. Sometimes they become so good at carrying it that you'd never know it was there. That's one of the biggest lessons my granddad taught me. Not through anything he said, but through my experience of helping him. That compassion isn't about lowering expectations. It's that everyone has a story, and you probably don't know it. And looking back, I think that made me much better as a consultant, and a much better leader, and I hope a much better person. So by this point, I come to a conclusion. University, at least in the traditional sense, just didn't feel right for me. It wasn't because I'd stopped loving learning. If anything, it was the opposite. I love learning. I collect qualifications the same way some people collect trainers. If there's a course, I'm probably halfway through it. The issue was never education. The issue was the environment. I'd realised there was a difference. I still wanted to be challenged academically. I still wanted a degree. I still wanted to spend hours disappearing down rabbit holes that nobody had asked me to go down. But I wanted to do that in a way that gave me flexibility. Partly because I had care and responsibilities, partly because life had become so much less predictable, and partly because, although I didn't know it at the time, that's simply how my brain works best. So I started looking at Open University. To be honest, at the time, some people treated it like it was second choice, almost as though it was a get a degree if plan A hadn't worked out. I never saw it that way. To me, it felt like freedom. It meant I could build my education around my life, instead of trying to squeeze my life around my education. Looking back, I think it was one of the first really good accommodations I ever gave myself, before I knew I needed them. And here's the bit that still makes me smile. Fast forward a few years, I've now completed my degree with the Open University. Not just that, I now work with the Open University to deliver accessibility training, which feels wonderfully circular, and sometimes life has a funny sense of humour. One thing that really stuck with me is just how many people openly identify as neurodivergent. It's not hidden, it's not whispered about, it's becoming increasingly normal. People talk about accessibility. People ask what someone might need to do their best work. Nobody acts as though it's an inconvenience. It's simply part of the culture. And that's been incredibly refreshing, because I realised something. For years, I've been trying to get that triangle and force it into the square. And then almost by accident, I found a triangular environment. I found the environment that adapted itself to people so that everybody could succeed to the best of their ability. There's two completely different philosophies. One says, how can we make this person fit? And the other one says, how do we help this person do their best? As someone who now spends quite a bit of their time advising businesses, I can tell you which question will lead to better results. There's a phrase I hear quite a lot: we're all treated the same here. It's usually said with the best of intentions, but it's not a phrase I ever really liked, because it's simply not true. And treating everybody the same isn't the same as treating everybody fairly. If I'm 5'3" and someone else is 6'4", giving us the same sized bicycle isn't equality. One of us is going to have a much more interesting journey. The goal shouldn't be to treat everybody identically. The goal should be to create an environment where everybody has the best opportunity to perform. That's what good leadership looks like. That's what good governance looks like. And increasingly, I'm seeing that the most successful businesses are the ones that do just that. So looking back now, choosing the Open University wasn't settling. It was taking a route that could actually work with my brain rather than against it. And it turns out that decision changed my life probably far more than not accepting a place at King's. So while all this was going on, I wasn't exactly staying still. I was studying with the Open University. I also realised that full-time study, as we refer to it, is kind of code for studying a few hours a day. So I used to play a little game with myself where I'd get up at the same time as my partner and I'd try to see if I could be done with my study by 10 o'clock in the morning. And I usually could. So alongside this, I decided to do some writing and a bit of modelling. I also volunteered as an appropriate adult with the police. For anyone who hasn't come across the role before, effectively an appropriate adult supports vulnerable people and children who are in custody. So whether you're there to help them understand what's happening, to help make sure they're being treated fairly, and they can properly participate in the process. I absolutely loved it. It combined everything I'd always enjoyed: law, people, problem solving, justice, all at 2 o'clock in the morning. And then something happened that caught me completely off guard. A lot of the people I was supporting had ADHD. When I'd signed up, I'd assumed I'd be primarily helping teenagers. But no, the single most common condition I saw that needed my help was ADHD. And I listened to them talk about their experiences. And I'd find myself thinking, hang on, I do that. Or that sounds familiar, or doesn't everybody do that? Now I should point out, I still had absolutely no intention of believing I had ADHD, because this is already painted a very stereotypical position in my head. That ADHD was little boys bouncing off walls, getting into trouble, never sitting still. That wasn't me. So I actually concluded I couldn't possibly have ADHD. Just slightly ironic, considering I now spend a lot of time telling people that ADHD doesn't look like that for many people. And then one day, one of the people I was supporting looked at me and said, you know, I think you've got ADHD. It was probably the most unexpected feedback anybody's ever had at work. I just remember staring at them and thinking, well, that's not what I thought this was going with. Plants the seed, not a diagnosis, just a question. And questions have a habit of sticking around in my brain, especially when they don't quite have an answer. Over the next few months, I found noticing more and more things. I'd read something, I'd watch a video, I'd hear someone describe ADHD, and I'd think that's oddly specific. Then I'd imminently dismiss it, because I still believed the stereotype was more valuable than my own experience. And looking back, I really think that's one of the biggest problems we have, is that people do know about ADHD, but they look at it from the view that they know what it looks like. If I asked everybody in the room to close their eyes and picture someone with ADHD, I imagine you'd picture Bart Simpson. That's not wrong. Those people have it as well. It's just not the whole picture. ADHD isn't always loud. It can look successful, it can look organised, it can look like someone who's built 15 different coping mechanisms that no one ever notices. Sometimes it looks like someone who is absolutely exhausted trying so hard to appear fine. And that's something I wished I'd known a lot earlier. Many neurodivergent people don't spend their life learning how to function. We spend our lives looking like we know how to function. And those are two very different things. I didn't know it then, but that conversation in the custody suite would quietly change the rest of my life. Because for the first time, the very first time, I wondered whether there might not be something wrong with me after all. Maybe there was just another explanation. So at this point, I thought I was going to end up working back in law. If you'd asked me, I would have said, yes, I'll be back in the court and I'll be doing legislation. And volunteering as an appropriate adult only reinforced that. It felt like important work, meaningful work. And most importantly, I felt like I was genuinely making a difference. I went into that role believing something quite simple. I believed the justice system was fundamentally a good system that occasionally got things wrong. I thought I'd spend a career helping make it a little bit better. But then the reality arrived. The more time I spent there, the more complicated my thinking became. Now, I want to be really clear. I met some really extraordinary people, some really extraordinary police officers who genuinely cared, solicitors who worked tirelessly, custody staff who were incredible despite very difficult challenges. My criticism is not of the individuals, far from it, because you can admire people but question the wider system. And that's where I found myself. There were things that I struggled to reconcile with my own values. There were moments where I walked home thinking, I know what happened there, but I'm just not sure it's quite right. And I couldn't ignore that. One thing you'll probably notice about me is that I find it very difficult to ignore things that don't make sense, which is actually really, really useful in anti-money laundering. Slightly less useful if you're trying to switch off your brain at 12 o'clock at night. About 6 months into volunteering, I came into a conclusion that surprised me. I wasn't going to build a career in criminal justice. At the time, it felt like another failure, another plan that hadn't worked out, another identity I had to let go of. But looking back, I don't see it like that at all. I wasn't walking away from helping people. I was walking towards a different way of helping people. I just didn't know what that looked like yet. I think that's something we don't quite tell people often enough. We tend to talk about changing direction as though it's giving up. But I don't think it is. I think you change direction because you've actually learned something. You've gathered new information, you've grown, you've got a little bit further along the roadmap, and you realise that your values and the environment don't quite line up. So you adjust. That's not a failure, that's good judgment. We call it decision making, yet people do it in their careers and it's something they often feel guilty about. And that's not something I understand. Changing your mind is not a weakness, it's wisdom. At the time though, it didn't feel wise. It felt uncertain. Once again, I found myself asking, well, what am I going to do? I had absolutely no idea, and the answer came from the most strange place. Not a law firm, not a university, not a police station, but a conversation at the job centre. And looking back, it's one of the most important conversations of my life. So, a careers advisor said to me, if you've ruled out law, and you've ruled out criminal justice, and you've turned down university, what are you going to do? And there were moments where I asked myself, so what is next? And he said, honestly, you've got absolutely no idea. So we did something very sensible, and we went down to the job centre, and as if I was in a Hollywood film, you expect me to meet a billionaire entrepreneur down there. I didn't, but I did bump into a different careers advisor who said, have you genuinely asked the question, what is available and what is hiring? From there, we started to have a look. We started to talk about everything, not just qualifications, but about me, what I enjoyed, what frustrated me, what I was good at, what gave me energy. Looking back, I realised he was doing something that I now encourage leaders to do with their own people. He wasn't trying to fit me into a job, he was trying to understand me as a person. At the end of the conversation, he looked at me and asked a question that completely changed my life. Have you ever thought about financial services? Because that's kind of what we have here. I laughed, because it hadn't even crossed my mind. Not once. If you'd asked me to list 50 industries I might end up working in, that would not have made the list. He said something incredibly simple. You're on the Isle of Man, financial services is one of the biggest industries. If you build a career there, you will never be out of work. At the time, it sounds like practical advice, sensible advice, but nothing more than that. But it did completely change everything. And that always reminds me how a conversation can have such an important impact. I do wonder whether he remembers that. I've not run into him again, and I think maybe he doesn't. But it's all of that influence you can have on people's futures without even realising it. For him, it was another appointment, but for me, it altered the entire course of my career. And that's quite a big responsibility if you think about it. We often think of the biggest moments in our lives as the one we'll recognise at the time, winning an award, wedding, a graduation. And sometimes they are, but quite often the biggest turning point is just an ordinary day, an ordinary conversation with someone who sees something in you you never considered in yourself. It's one of the reasons I try to be careful what I say to people now, because you never know what conversation's going to change somebody's life. But of course, there was a small problem. I knew absolutely nothing about the financial services, which meant that when he suggested I apply for a compliance role, I immediately thought, what's compliance? And that brings me to my very first interview. So he said, just go to the interview. He wasn't trying to persuade me to take the job. He just said, go and see what it's like. If you hate it, you never have to do it again, but at least you know. Looking back, that's brilliant advice. Sometimes we spend too much time trying to make the perfect decision when we could just make a decision and then change it afterwards. Sometimes you just have to be curious enough to go through the door. So I applied for the compliance assistant role. And to be honest with you, I hadn't prepared at all. I mean, I had considered what the job was, but I hadn't even read through the job description. I'd never worked in the financial services, I'd never worked in compliance, I didn't know anybody who worked in compliance, so I had no idea what the job would actually involve. In fact, I remember reading in the job interview, the job description as they slid it across the desk to me, and coming across a word I'd never seen before, fiduciary. Now, if you work in the industry, you hear that all the time. At the time, I didn't know how to pronounce it, and I ended up sitting there trying to sound it out. Fiduciary was how I came to it, hoping desperately that nobody would ask me to say it out loud. Looking back, I do find this absolutely hilarious, because these days, most of my clients are fiduciary businesses. Apparently, life decided the best way for me to deal with my fear was just to give it a go. And here's the thing, I almost didn't. I thought, I'm not qualified enough, I don't know enough, they'll realise I don't know anything. I think everybody has that feeling, and that's the moment where you've convinced yourself that everybody has a clue. And I really believe they don't. I often joke about, I was under the misapprehension that there are hordes of talented people who know everything about everything. I'm still trying to find them. There aren't, there's just people that will give something a go. Most people are making far more up about what they do than they actually admit, and I think that's especially true at the beginning of a career. Experts don't arrive fully formed. You don't show up out of the womb knowing about money laundering regulations. Everybody starts somewhere, everybody has a first interview, everybody has a moment where they think, I'm completely out of my depth. And the difference isn't confidence, it's curiosity, and it's that curiosity that's going to keep you learning. It's one of the most valuable skills in governance as well, as I've discovered over the years, because good governance is not about pretending you know all of the answers. It's about asking better questions than everybody else. I walked out of the interview thinking, well, at least that was an interesting experience. I certainly wasn't expecting what happened next, because an hour later, the phone rang. And they offered me a job. Now, because this is my first professional job interview, I made a completely unreasonable assumption. I thought that's how recruitment works. So I genuinely believed that every employer interviewed everybody, had a quick chat, and then rang them an hour later and said you have the job, which isn't how it works, as it turned out. I accepted the job and started the following week. At the same time, I was still studying my degree with the Open University, so I was working full-time and studying full-time. Looking back, I sometimes wonder if I've always had the ADHD moment of, this seems quite busy. My brain says, excellent, let's add another qualification. The learning curve was enormous. Only 1 week earlier I'd been trying to pronounce fiduciary, and now I was sitting in an office surrounded by acronyms I'd never heard of. AML, CDD, PEPs, SARS, source of funds, source of wealth. It felt like everybody had been handed a dictionary I'd somehow missed. I remember sitting there thinking, please don't ask me what any of these mean. I genuinely didn't know, but something interesting started to happen. I was willing to ask. The more I learnt, the more I loved it. Compliance wasn't what I imagined. I'd assumed it was ticking boxes, reading policies. It's about spotting patterns, asking questions, and thinking ahead. Seeing the thing everybody else has missed. And suddenly I realised I'd been practicing these skills my entire life. This was just the first time anybody was paying me to use them. Not long after I started, I was working through a huge pile of risk assessments, sitting on the desk and spreading them all out over the floor, every single one. I was organising them, comparing them, looking for bigger pictures, understanding the patterns. A director walked past, looked down at me and said, "The floor is surrounded by paperwork. You have to be a very specific type of person to enjoy doing that job." And you know what? I think he was right. Most people would look at that and say it's incredibly boring, but I thought it was brilliant. That's one of the biggest things I've learned about neurodiversity. People often say, "Oh, what's your superpower?" or "ADHD is your superpower." And that's not the right question. It's what kind of problems light up your brain. Someone else finds something endlessly frustrating. But for me, I find it endlessly enjoyable. Risk, governance, patterns, complex systems, not because I'm unusually clever, but because that's how my brain likes to think. Work stops feeling quite so much like work when you find something that naturally aligns with how your brain functions. At the time though, I still had absolutely no idea what any of this was. I certainly didn't think I'd build a career in compliance, and I definitely didn't think I'd end up running my own consultancy. And I had no idea that in just a few years' time, I'd be standing there accepting the Outstanding Achievement Award in anti-money laundering. In fact, I remember during my first week, Googling, what does AML stand for? Which, as you'll discover in a couple of slides, isn't a joke. So, at this time, my granddad died. We knew it was coming. His health had been declining for a long time, but it didn't make it any easier. I spent the previous few years helping him, and without realising it, caring for him had become part of my routine and my identity. And almost every night that disappeared. It's a really strange feeling. You spend years wishing someone didn't have to suffer anymore. And then when they don't, you find yourself wondering what you're supposed to do with everything that's been left behind. It made me think of everything differently. It made me think differently about dignity, about vulnerability, about independence. And it made me realise something that has stayed with me throughout my career. We spend an awful lot of time measuring people by what they produce, their output, their efficiency. Very rarely do we stop and think about the person actually underneath it. Watching somebody gradually lose their ability to do things changes your perspective on that. It reminded me that value isn't productivity. Value is something much bigger than that. Looking back, I also think losing my granddad quietly shaped the kind of consultant I've become, because governance at its heart isn't really about policies, it's about people. Compliance isn't really about regulation, it's about protecting people. Risk isn't really about spreadsheets, it's about understanding what would happen if something went wrong. That's probably why I've always enjoyed this work. People sometimes ask me, how do you stay interested in governance? The answer is because governance is never really about just governance, it's about people, and people are wonderfully complicated, and they don't make rational decisions, and they don't communicate clearly, and they don't always tell you what's wrong. Which, if you're trying to understand a risk, is really fascinating. I think my granddad taught me something else as well. He taught me that people spend their entire lives trying to adapt to a world that doesn't fit them. And as I mentioned earlier, we suspected he might always have been autistic, we'll never know, but I often think about him growing up in a world where he may have been perpetually masking, where nobody talks about sensory overload, where nobody talks about burnout, where you just expected to get on with it. And he did, like so many of his generation. Sometimes I wonder how many older people lived their whole lives not understanding what might have been a little bit different about them. That thought really does make me quite sad, because one of the greatest gifts my diagnosis gave me wasn't a label, it was understanding, and I wish other people could have that too. Losing him also did mark the end of one chapter of my life. I had more time, I had more freedom, more opportunity to focus on my career. I thought life was finally beginning to settle down, maybe, but then something else happened that was not according to plan. So like I said, I'd turned up for my first proper day and I'd Googled what does AML stand for. I don't mean I had no vague idea, I mean I literally did not know at all what AML could stand for. So I genuinely Googled this at work. I opened the VPN and I Googled this on a work computer. And the reason I tell that story is because people always assume that I actually know a lot of things. I know a lot of things because I've learned about them, because I'm willing to ask. When I see anything to do with consultancy, qualifications, the articles, talks, the award, people look at me and I'm sometimes introduced as an expert. And I always smile to myself when I think that, because I think the only reason I've got any expertise is because I'm willing to find out. There was just Google and curiosity. and I found something out. And I think that's one of the biggest things we don't understand about expertise, that we imagine that experts are born ready, and I don't think many of them are. I think they're people that have become comfortable asking questions, and they aren't embarrassed about asking them. And the funny thing is, the more I learned about AML, the more I realised that's exactly how my brain works. And if there's one thing my brain loves, it's spotting something that doesn't fit. And suddenly, all those things around me just started to make sense. And it was becoming an advantage. So then, everything changed. For about 3 months, life was good, which sounds like a very simple sentence, but actually felt quite significant at the time. I loved my job, I was studying with the OU, I was learning something new every day, I liked the people I worked with, I liked the challenge, I liked finally having a proper salary, and if I'm honest, I quite liked being on my lunch, not checking my bank balance. For the first time in a long time, I remember thinking, I think I found it. I think I found where I'm meant to be. And that was one of the moments when everything felt like it made sense. I just enjoyed being 20-something, 19 it was, and finally feeling like my life was heading in the right direction. But then everything changed because my mum became seriously ill. And again, overnight, everything changed. Suddenly, there was still work, there was still my degree, I was still doing my professional qualifications, but they were no longer the centre of my world. My family was. It's funny because life has a way of forcing you to rearrange priorities very fast. A diagnosis, a phone call, a conversation, suddenly everything changes. But it isn't because you've done anything wrong, it isn't because I've made a bad decision, it's because that's just what life does, and I think that's really important. We spend too much time trying to build the perfect 5-year plan, but life will interrupt it. And life doesn't usually wait until it's convenient. That's why I sometimes think resilience isn't about being strong, it's about being adaptable. It's about asking, given where I am today, what is the best thing to do, and how do I do it? Not, how do I get back to the plan? Because quite often, there isn't a way back to the plan. And sometimes that's more than enough. So my mum received a diagnosis, and some of you who are local may already know a little bit about what happens next. That's absolutely fine if you don't, because when we were living through it, I didn't know either. We were taking one day at a time, one appointment at a time, one conversation at a time. At the same time, life carried on. Still working, still studying, still doing my CA qualifications. But then every evening after work, I went to hospital. And I genuinely don't know how I did it, looking back. I look at all the things I did and I wonder, how did this happen in the time that I had? But I think that you stop asking yourself, can I do this? And you start asking, what's the next thing that needs doing? One of the strange things about ADHD is that in a crisis, many of us become incredibly calm. It's almost as though the chaos has finally reached the outside, what it is in the inside, and then you've been practicing for that for years. And when everything becomes urgent, suddenly we know what to do. It's one of the reasons that I say ADHD isn't simply a deficit, because it has that power to just turn you on right when you're most needed. But that doesn't mean that it's not exhausting, because it is. And it's much more complicated than people realise. I still turn up at my job, I still smile, I still answer emails, sit in meetings, but from the outside everything looked fine. But everything we were seeing was my performance, my attendance, my mood, my productivity, but that only tells you one thing. And I think that's super important for business leaders to think about, that you don't know what's going on with people unless you take the time to find out. So I think extraordinary people do extraordinary things every single day. And consistently, people don't say, I'm struggling, or I need some support, or I'm not okay today. But the irony is when people do feel safe enough in businesses to say that, leaders find out there's a problem. Because if you don't find that out, you're waiting until somebody burns out, resigns, or becomes unwell. And by then, it's usually much harder to help. And I think that's one of the most important things I've learned in my entire career, that we don't really know what anybody else is carrying until we take the time to find out. So, unfortunately, my mum died by suicide. Even now, that's a very, very strange sentence to say. Not because I'm ashamed of it, but because it's one of those things that feels so completely as if it happened in a different life, and that I'm a much different person afterwards. Our relationship wasn't simple. We loved each other very much, but it's always complicated in any family. Things were never quite resolved. So when my mum died, I wasn't just grieving for the person I'd lost. I was grieving for the conversations we'd never had, the relationships we never quite managed to build. I think that's one of the hardest things about grief. Sometimes grief is just about sadness, sometimes it's not. It's also about regret. And somehow I had to think of all of these things and do all of these things before having breakfast. So grief really isn't tidy. It doesn't follow a timetable. it simply arrives. And one thing I've learned since is that we feel an enormous amount of pressure to grieve properly and to feel like we should. There's like a way we're going to perform grief. Like I often laugh, should I be a Victorian widow in a big black dress and sit around crying? Because everybody grieves differently and there is no right or wrong way to do it. There's just a way you can do it. The biggest thing it actually taught me was about compassion. We see people on LinkedIn, successful version, but we don't know what it required to turn up that day. We almost never see what's happening behind the scenes. I'm not saying that all business leaders should become therapists, but I think leaders can create an environment where we're giving people that safety to ask for help before they reach a crisis point. That doesn't mean that every crisis can be prevented. Sadly, it can't. But I do think we can build workplaces where people feel a little bit less alone than they might have done otherwise. I don't say this because it's sympathy. I think it's quite an uncomfortable fact that the experiences that we have shape us in ways we wouldn't have chosen, and they change what we see as value. Losing my mum changed almost everything about the way I think, about leadership, success, kindness, but also the importance of noticing people. Because if difficult experiences can't always be avoided, perhaps the best thing we can do is become more compassionate to those experiencing them. So while this was going on, I was still doing everything, and people ask me now, how did you actually manage this? And I say, I don't know. If I'd sat down and looked at the whole picture, I probably would have been completely overwhelmed. It's lucky that I never did that. I do what I still do today, which is I ask myself one question, and I'll just work with that. And then the next thing, and just work with that and solve the next problem, and then on the next one. And eventually you realise you've climbed a whole mountain without ever even realising it. Sometimes people describe me as resilient, and I appreciate that, but I don't think resilience feels particularly inspiring when you're living it. I think it feels very, very ordinary. I think it feels like answering an email or opening a textbook and turning up. I think resilience, particularly structurally in companies, is much quieter than we would imagine, and that's something I've reflected a lot on since my diagnosis. A lot of what I thought was being professional was actually masking. It wasn't just doing my job. I was doing my job while simultaneously trying to look like I was doing my job. It felt as if I was cosplaying as a person. I know that's a ridiculous phrase, but somebody said it to me once, and it's the most accurate thing I've ever heard. Because underneath all of it, you are still you. You're just putting on a mask. And I think that's one of the reasons that late diagnosis felt so emotional. Because finally, I realised how much energy I'd been putting into looking like I knew what was going on, looking like I was being like everybody else. And that's exhausting. And that's why I'm passionate about creating organisations with environments where people don't feel they have to perform a version of themselves. Because imagine what people could achieve if they spent all of that energy doing their job. So after my mum died, I just kept going. People often imagine grief as crying and being sad, being unable to get out of bed. Sometimes it doesn't look like that. Sometimes it looks like throwing yourself into work, being more productive, studying harder. And I think that was me. And then there was everything that came afterwards. The inquest, the legal processes, the paperwork. And that wasn't something I think you're ever really ready for, the media. I remember closing the curtains because journalists were outside our house. It was a very strange experience. And at that point in your life, you realise all you want is privacy because your family's worst day becomes news. And it certainly changed how I see everything. And people often ask me why I'm so open now and why I write so honestly and why I stand on stages and tell people about the hardest experience of my life. And part of the answer is this: when you've had your life publicly reported on, you stop being quite so frightened about people knowing your story. And the other part is a lot more simple. I'm just not afraid anymore. Not in the way I used to be, because I realised something. Silence didn't protect me. Pretending everything was fine didn't protect me. Masking didn't protect me. If anything, it made me lonelier. It's much easier now to tell the truth, because I don't expect everybody to agree with me, and I don't want sympathy. I just think there's something quiet about everybody thinking I thought I was the only one. If sharing my story means one person goes home feeling less alone, then it's worth it. One of the things I always say is that humour has become one of my coping mechanisms. People apologise for laughing when I tell parts of my story. Please don't, some of it is genuinely funny. If I tell you I buy a giant chocolate bar after starting my ADHD medication, ate one row, put it in the fridge and forgot the rest of it existed, and that is how I knew the medication was working, that's funny. If I tell you the McDonald's staff asked me to rate members of staff on eye contact and I put in a complaint, you'd say that was funny. I remember thinking, my eyes make contact if they want to. Frankly, I quite enjoyed not having to discuss the weather while collecting my fries. I've realised something over the last few years. I can't change what's happened to me, but I can choose how I respond to it. And personally, I'd rather laugh where I can, because if I'm laughing, I'm having a much better day than the person who's pretending nothing is funny. That doesn't diminish the difficult parts. It just means that I take everything together. That period wasn't about moving on. It was about learning to live with what I have. So everything then changed overnight. I won the ICA qualification Outstanding Achievement Award in Anti-Money Laundering. And first I thought, oh, that's nice. And then I explained what it actually meant. I achieved the highest mark in the world. And I was the first person to ever do that from an offshore jurisdiction, and the first person under 30. And I remember thinking when I opened the brochure to see this, are you sure you found the right person? Because quite frankly, when I left that exam, I thought I was going to have to resit. Whenever people ask me about my award, my mind always goes to that day where I was Googling, what does AML stand for? Because expertise isn't where you begin, it's where you come to by learning. And after a little while, when I was at the awards ceremony, Pekka Dare, who's the president of the ICA, who was presenting the awards, said, the work you do saves lives. Now I thought that's quite a big statement. And to this day, my family still joke that I'm a pretend paramedic. Because most days I'm reading regulations, reviewing frameworks, and asking awkward questions. It doesn't feel like I'm in an action film. But the more I think about it, the more I realise that he was probably right. Behind every fraud, there's victims, families, businesses, communities. Compliance isn't about paperwork, it's about protecting people. And that's why I love it. Although I will admit that when I did next time end up in an ambulance, I did tell the paramedic that I also saved lives. He looked at me in a way that suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. One of the things that this award gave me wasn't just confidence, it was evidence. Evidence that I wasn't trying to be someone I wasn't. Evidence that I was already there. Seeing connections that other people hadn't spotted yet. For the first time, I stopped thinking, why am I different? And started thinking, perhaps different is exactly why I'm good at this. I think it changed what I believed was possible. Sometimes people assume that winning an award changes everything and that life suddenly becomes easy. It didn't. Doors opened. That's true. The truth is, it doesn't suddenly become simpler because you've got an award. I was still studying full time. I was still trying to get my degree done. And then from the outside, everybody was saying, well done. And I was still living with all of this. Most of the time, arriving and being successful looks remarkably ordinary. I always say, good compliance isn't evidenced by somebody ringing the sales bell. It's evidenced by the fact that we haven't burnt down. People often see milestones, but for me, what's actually made me was everything that happened around it. Moving from, I'm not sure I can do this, to doing it anyway. And it was around this time that I changed roles. And it's given me so many different ways of thinking, meeting different leaders, being exposed to different businesses, some brilliant, some educational. And I don't mean that negatively. One of the things I've learned is that you can learn just as much from people who are poor in leadership as you can from people who are good at it. I began to ask myself, if I ever led people, what environment would I want to create? And that question still stays with me. Because I don't think leadership is about having all the answers. It's about being able to go to people who might, and being able to talk it through. And around this time, I also started saying yes to more opportunities, writing articles, speaking to professionals. And I realised that confidence was a side effect of repeatedly discovering the thing I'd been worried about probably wasn't anywhere near as frightening as it was when it happened. And that's because one of the reasons I've learned is that you don't wait to feel confident. If you do, you'll be waiting a very, very long time. You do something and you learn from it. Confidence will catch up later. There wasn't a big dramatic turning point in my career. It was hundreds of ordinary days, ordinary decisions, ordinary moments. And that's how careers are really built. Not in headlines, not in awards, but in the quiet decision to keep showing up. And without realising, I was about to discover something that would change almost every chapter of my life up until that point. So, I was diagnosed with ADHD, autism, post-traumatic stress disorder, anxiety and depression, which is quite a long list. I often joke I have too many letters, more letters after my name than I can, I ended up in hospital after a severe episode of vaginal bleeding, and nobody knew what was going on. ADHD would not have been high on my list. If you gave somebody what might cause this, I wouldn't say ADHD. But during investigations, a clinician asked me a question that caught me completely off guard. Have you ever been assessed for ADHD? And I remember thinking, sorry, what has any of this got to do with ADHD? And it turns out the link is dopamine. Dopamine interacts with hormonal pathways. And in people with ADHD, dopamine controls estrogen. So that means it can impact things like heavy bleeding. It doesn't cause it, but it can add to it. But it was interesting enough for someone to say, is this worth exploring? So I ended up booking a private assessment. For those of you who don't know, adults on the Isle of Man have to pay for their own assessments for ADHD and autism. So I certainly wasn't expecting what happened next. After several hours of assessment, the psychiatrist looked at me and said, you meet all of the criteria for ADHD. Every single one. 24 out of 24 criteria, and you have them all. If we think about the spectrum, here. So it felt as though someone had sort of got me and shaken me. It was really overwhelming to begin with, and I thought, hang on, how could this have been for so long without me noticing? But then there was something else, a sense of relief, which was really unexpected, because it wasn't that I suddenly had labels, it was that I finally knew what was going on. I always joke that I didn't catch ADHD. I'd had it my whole life. I'd always been this person, I just hadn't had the language to find it. But it gave me permission to be myself and stop blaming myself for things not being how I thought they would be. I always thought, why was I exhausted from social events? Why could I hyper-focus for 12 hours but completely forget to eat? Why did I notice tiny habits other people seem to miss? Why did they always feel slightly out of step with everyone around me? And suddenly, I had answers. Not excuses, but answers. And I think that's a really important distinction. A diagnosis didn't lower my expectations of myself. If anything, it raised them. You stop spending all of your energy trying to be somebody else, and you start building a life around who you already are. And once the story changes, everything else starts to look different. So, in a 48-hour time period, I received my diagnosis and I lost my job. So, like a lot of people who receive diagnosis, I left with very, very mixed emotions, relief, validation, grief for years of not understanding myself, also optimism. For the first time, I have a roadmap. But it wasn't as if something became easier. I went back to work on the Monday and I decided I need to tell my employer. Didn't have to, just thought it was probably the right thing to do. I believed if I was open about my diagnosis, we could have a sensible conversation about what we could do to work forward. It's not the obvious thing to do. I lost my job on Wednesday. I'm not going to go into details, but it's something that's still ongoing and it's important to me, and I don't want to comment on matters that are still being dealt with. But I can tell you how it felt. It felt as though I'd finally found the missing piece of the puzzle, and then the table disappeared. One moment, I finally understood my brain, and the next I was trying to work out my future. It was confusing, genuinely frightening. If I'm honest, it was incredibly lonely, because I'd spent years wondering whether there was an explanation. I finally found one, and immediately I didn't have a job. It's amazing how quickly your brain starts asking difficult questions. Was I right to say anything? Should I have kept it to myself? Would this have happened if I stayed quieter? And I think those are very human questions. Now, I look at that very differently. At the time, I thought the diagnosis and losing my job were two really, really big life events. But something else happened. For the first time in my life, I started questioning the environment instead of questioning myself. For years, every time something felt difficult, I thought, what is wrong with me? Now I think, what's wrong about the environment? You start looking in places you can actually thrive. And I think that's true for all of us, neurodivergent or not. And it matters for well-being and performance and all of those things inside a workplace. And it matters for good governance, because culture isn't just values written on a bit of paper. It's whether an employer is going to listen to you. It's a fair question. And honestly, sometimes I regret what happens, but I don't regret telling the truth, because I believe organisations should be places where people can be open about who they are. Then I have to find myself willing to live as I want to. It wasn't the outcome I'd hoped for, but it did force me to ask a question in hindsight that changed everything. If I could find an environment where I could do my best work, where would that be? Maybe I'd have to build one for myself. And that was the seed that became my consultancy. So, in my new reality, nobody really prepared me for what would happen after diagnosis. I'd kind of assumed that you'd get a paper and that would be the finish line, but it's only the start. I had my answer, I had my report, and that's it. But no, that was where the journey began, which was a bit of a shame. And for me, it was follow-up appointments, learning about ADHD and autism, trying medication, finding the right dose. People often say, how do you know your medication is working? Like I said about the chocolate bar, it's the tiny things that make you realise your brain is recalibrating. And it's funny because the medication only lasts 8 hours. So you can sort of have 2 different ways of working. I joke, it's like if your home language is French and you go out and you speak English and then you pop home and you speak something else. But there was something a bit more kind of immediate about all of this. I'd been diagnosed privately, and that came with a cost. And I just lost my job. I'd spent years trying to look for an explanation. I had one, and then I had to ask myself, can I actually afford treatment? Which is why I say that it's like a work version of Breaking Bad, because I had to find a way of paying for it. Which was just one of the moments that everything is there to break down barriers. Awareness is important, but awareness on its own isn't enough. You can have a diagnosis, but if you can't access medication, therapy, coaching, adjustments, then that awareness is just awareness. It's not solved any problems. Starting medication was fascinating for me. I'd heard people describe it as putting on glasses for the first time, and I wasn't really sure what they meant. And when I took it, it wasn't my personality changed. It wasn't that I suddenly became different. It was just all of that noise quietened. And for the first time, I could choose what I paid attention to. And none of this had ever happened before, and I actually just went back later to check that chocolate bar was still there. And I remember thinking, who is this person? It was such a tiny thing, but it taught me the medication was working. Not making me someone different, helped me become the person I probably was underneath all the noise. Sometimes people ask me whether medication makes me neurotypical, whether it fixes ADHD. No, not only because ADHD isn't something that's broken, but also because ADHD doesn't give me a better brain, it just makes me slightly better and more efficient at using the one that I've got. And then suddenly I understood why I found events exhausting, why I needed recovery time. And honestly, it's the little things I'd spent years assuming my personality quirks suddenly had context. And that context is incredibly powerful, because once you start seeing something, you can't unsee it. It also changed the relationship I had with myself, because I became kinder and more patient. Less interested in pretending I could do what everybody else could do and asking what actually works for me. And that was the question that shaped everything since. Because understanding yourself isn't selfish, it's starting to build a life that's actually going to fit. The trouble is that something happened next that I couldn't ever have anticipated. The night my employment ended, I had my first seizure. I'd never had one before. I'd never considered that I might. I was frightened, I was confused, and if I'm honest, it was incredibly surreal, because 1 minute you're trying to process losing a job, and the next you're in an ambulance wondering what's happened to your own body. First, everybody quite rightly thought about epilepsy. That's where your mind goes, so I went through investigations, appointments, tests, more appointments. For months, nobody really knew what was happening. Eventually, I was diagnosed with functional neurological disorder, or more specifically, photopsychogenic non-epileptic seizures, or PNS, which makes me smile, because you wouldn't describe a seizure as non-epileptic. In simple terms, it's a way of saying a seizure that isn't caused by epilepsy. When I first heard this, I remember thinking, I knew trauma affected your mind, but I didn't realise it could affect your whole body. And subconsciously, I'd always imagined the brain and body were 2 separate things. But they're not, as though your emotions happen in one place and your health happened in another. But that's just not true. If you don't carry something in your mind, it's going to get carried somewhere else. For me, I think while I was angry for a long time and I was thinking, why is my body doing this to me? I now realise that my body was trying to protect me. The mechanism of having a seizure is where your body is trying to outlet something it can't otherwise outlet. It's like vomiting if you're unwell. And that shift in perspective for me has been incredibly important. Sometimes people ask me how I can still do all of this if I have it. And it's something I'm asked surprisingly often. The answer is, because I'm disabled, I'm not made of glass. I sometimes joke, I'm ADHD, not Cinderella. I don't have to be home by midnight. The point is that disability isn't all or nothing. Some days you can do more than others. Some days my body tells me to slow down. I've learned to listen, because otherwise I'm going to be learning paramedics' names. We often talk about mental health and physical health, but we don't talk about how closely those 2 things are connected. Even, for example, how chronic pain can be a symptom of stress. People don't leave their nervous system at the office door, and the healthiest organisations understand that. By this point, I realised I had a choice. I couldn't change what had happened, and I couldn't change my diagnosis. And I couldn't change the years I'd spent wondering why things didn't seem to be working for me. But I could choose what I did next, and that was one of the most empowering moments of my life. My business's byline is clarity where it counts. That came out of a conversation I had with the paramedic. He was saying it's totally unheard of that people that are having this level of seizure can call a paramedic. How did you do that? And I said, well, because I have clarity. I know something's wrong, so I do something about it. And he says, oh, well, it's funny you say that. ADHD is not about clarity. And I said, well, in that case, at least have clarity where it counts. And it just stuck. And I realised something. If all of this could happen to me, then what about all of this happening to anybody else? And that was quite a frightening thought, that this could happen to any of us all of the time, and that it's not a stereotype we've grown up with. I'm not the stereotype of ADHD or autism or PTSD. I'm not a stereotype of somebody who's got a disability. But what about all the people that are quietly exhausted, quietly masking? And I realised my story wasn't that unusual. I just never heard anybody tell it. So that's when I say, people either say it's a superpower or a tragedy, and that's far too simplistic. It's a genuine strength and incredibly difficult, both at the same time, before you've had coffee. And it's real life, and honestly, I think people deserve more than slogans. I always call it a superpowered versus screwed conversation, because neither tells the whole story. My ADHD didn't help me lose my job, but it probably helped me build my business. My autism didn't make grief easier, but it helped me to understand patterns nobody else could see. The same brain can create challenges and extraordinary strengths. Stop asking, is neurodiversity a strength or a weakness? And start asking, what environment allows this person to work at their best? That's a much better question. I spent years trying to prove people wrong, or I could spend even more years trying to build something that nobody else could. So I chose the second option, not because it was easier, but because it was healthier. And that's where things changed again. For the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid anymore. I wasn't afraid of people knowing. I wasn't afraid of using words like autistic or ADHD. I wasn't afraid of being judged, because I'd already had that happen. I'd survived all the things that can break people. And once you've done that, other people's opinions become surprisingly quiet. It didn't magically make everything okay, but it did give me direction I'd been searching for a very long time. And that's why I started speaking out and writing. On LinkedIn, I started writing about my conditions. I started writing to journals about what I've got and how it makes me live. And also some very slightly over-enthusiastic essays about governance. It wasn't that I was trying to build a personal brand. It was that I was trying to answer a question I couldn't stop thinking about. How did I get to 22 without anybody noticing? Because when I had my assessment, I reached every single criteria. Everybody had missed it, including me. So I started listening to psychologists, listening to adults with these conditions, talking to people, reaching out to universities to understand what they're researching. The problem is we've been taught an incredibly narrow picture of what neurodivergence looks like: the naughty child, the disruptive employee, the socially awkward genius. But the reality is far more interesting than that. We're not all Sheldon. Neurodivergent people are everywhere. I know, it sounds like, what do they say in James Bond? We have people everywhere. Florists have that view. Everybody's there. We're in every profession. And often we're quietly succeeding. Often we're quietly the ones wondering why we're spending twice as much energy succeeding as everybody else. One of the biggest ideas I've come across was something called masking, which is the process of hiding or suppressing certain parts of yourself. Trouble is, you don't know you're doing it. You think carefully before speaking, you try to follow unwritten social rules, you replay conversations afterwards, you wonder whether you made enough eye contact. That's why I loved not having to make eye contact when I got my fries at McDonald's. It was a relief. I thought I was cosplaying as a person, and it's such a ridiculous sentence, but it takes an extraordinary amount of energy, and eventually it will catch up with you. For example, people say, can you keep an eye on this? No, I've only got 2. Someone says, guerrilla warfare, and I think of gorillas. It's the first time I'd ever heard the phrase Marxist guerrillas. I actually pictured some gorillas handing out leaflets. Turns out I was taking it too literally. Completely different spelling. Those moments now make me laugh, because years ago I just thought it was odd. Now I see they're how my brain processes language. The more openly I speak about my own experiences, the more messages I start receiving. I never thought people would write to me and say, I thought I was the only one, or you just described my daughter, I'm 56 and I understand myself for the first time. I remember one message in particular. After I was interviewed on Max Radio, a woman contacted me saying she'd been listening in her car and ended up crying. Not because of me, but because she recognised herself. That message just stayed with me, because it reminds me you never know who's listening. Because advocacy is all about finding answers to things that haven't been answered yet. And that's why I started speaking. I also joke that while she was in her car listening to it, it was the day of the RTA in Ballasalla, so she probably heard me like 6 times while she was checking for road traffic updates. So it's probably just that. So there I was, newly diagnosed, no job, trying to figure out what comes next. And I was practically asking, how am I going to pay the bills? I thought I could spend ages trying to send out CVs for jobs that I probably wouldn't like, or I could try to build a job that would be right for me. And that's what I did. I was curious enough to build something from scratch. No clients, no guaranteed income, no certainty it'd work out, just a laptop and a lot of determination. People often imagine entrepreneurs are fearless. They're not. They're scared and they do it anyway. Nobody needs a governance consultant full time, but almost everybody needs one occasionally. And that was my market. Businesses don't wake up in the morning and think, you know what, we need a permanent governance consultant sitting in a corner. They think we just need some expertise when we need it. When regulation changes, when they're growing, when something goes wrong, when they're trying to build something new. So I built my business around that idea. No one needs me full time, but everyone needs me some of the time. And strangely, it seems to have worked. People often ask me, what's the secret to building a business? And there isn't one. I think the most successful people are people that notice a problem and try to come up with a solution to it. And mine was no different. The problem wasn't that there's nobody who's good at governance. There's loads of people that are excellent at it. It's just that there was nobody who was doing governance to hire. And I wanted governance to be practical, something people could actually understand rather than just tolerate. For me, starting a consultancy wasn't really a big risk. The bigger risk would have been doing nothing, standing still, waiting for confidence to arrive. But action comes first, and confidence catches up later. Today I'm incredibly lucky. My consultancy is booked months in advance, and I work with organisations that seem to trust me to solve increasingly interesting problems. I write, I speak, I build AI tools, and sometimes I stop and think, how on earth did this happen? Sometimes the opportunity you've been looking for has already arrived, and then once again, that just wasn't the plan. If that sounds messy, it's probably because it is. Nobody ever wakes up and thinks, today I'm going to build something, until they have to. Life overlaps, study overlaps, work overlaps, everything happens. And then you take a step, and then another one, and it leads to something else. One of the things that's fascinated me over the last few years is how many entrepreneurs have quietly said to me, I think I have ADHD as well, or I've just been diagnosed, or my wife keeps telling me to get assessed. And not all neurodivergent people become entrepreneurs, but there seems to be an interesting overlap. The best people are the people willing to tolerate that uncertainty and that risk. For the first time in my life, I wasn't trying to fit into somebody else's way of working. I was creating my own, and that was incredibly freeing. People often ask me, what's the biggest thing you've achieved? And honestly, it's not the award or the consultancy or speaking. It's that I no longer spend every day wondering why I fundamentally missed the memo about life. That's a much bigger achievement to me. Finding success wasn't about finding the perfect path. It was about finding the path that fits me, even if it wasn't the one that I'd expected. So, I wanted to finish off today by bringing something that I'd shown you. If it works, it might not. I tried to get it set up earlier. This is the AI bot that I built for my business. Oh, is it not done yet? Brilliant. The avatar will be back. So this isn't a real person. This is an AI that I programmed based off my face originally.
Welcome back. Let's continue.
Hello. So thank you so much for talking to me today. What was it that you wanted to ask me about?
Look, before we get into the weeds, I'm under pressure here. This isn't just a routine sign-off, it's honestly a bit of a headache. I've got concerns with the broker setup and the source of funds, and I'm not convinced everything stacks up how it should.
Ooh, thank you for letting me know about that. Can you give me a little walkthrough of what's happened so far?
Right, so I've already had to push back internally just to keep this moving. And now with the off-panel broker and that sudden switch in funding, I'm stuck. None of this matches what we've seen before with your client.
Oh, okay. Well, thank you very much for letting me know about that. What is it exactly that doesn't match?
I mean, first, this new offshore funder just appears, no background, no paperwork, nothing to tie it into the usual cash flows. I'm not clear how that's supposed to be normal.
So that was just to show you a little bit about the kind of things that I've been making. So now to finish off, we will go onto the Slido. I've just put it back up in case anybody needs it. And I've not had anything pinging through, which suggests to me...
Sorry, I'm not really following. Slido? That's not where my head is right now. I'm more focused on the gaps around the broker and funding. I can't just ignore those.
I'm going to have to ignore you. I do apologise. We'll talk later, Cindy. There we are. See, it does actually respond to what you're saying. There you go. So I'm just reloading the Slido now Cindy's finished. I can see there's about 5 questions, but none of them are loading. So if anybody would like to just shout while I try and make it work, that would be great. There we are. So the first one is, how come this isn't a service other people offer? So I think primarily it's because the people who often have the skills to find business relationships aren't also the people with the skills in risk alerts compliance. I think it's that crossover that makes what I'm doing relatively unique. I think no skill set on its own is extraordinary. It's putting them together that'll make something truly interesting. Let's see if anything else has come through. I'm on 1 bar of Wi-Fi. But yeah, let's make this last part of the evening a conversation. So if anybody has got anything to add, I'm not sure the Slido's working. So probably just best to say it because I can see loads of questions, but not what they say. Just typical. But thank you very much for listening to me, and I will let you get on with the rest of your day.
Thank you.